Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I've found in my travels, and sometimes I take part in a booktube challenge, which is what today's video is all about. If you recall, I was issued a challenge by Lucas from the Bits of Lit to read Swamp Thing. And as it turns out, there's like six installments, 6 volumes in this series, and we're going to read them each month as we go through the story of Swamp Thing, at least as told by Alan Moore. And that is why my story today is, of course, Swamp Thing Volume 2 by Alan Moore, which was published around 1984 and 1985. I've talked about Alan Moore, especially in regards to Swamp Thing before, but just to make another note, Alan Moore was a writer, or is a writer, a United Kingdom writer, who has written a number of well-regarded comic books. Nothing more to say about him that I haven't said already, but he did do an interview recently where he talked about the infantilization of adults as it pertains to too many comic book movies, and he says it's like a precursor to fascism, and I'm inclined to agree with him in how too much of a focus on strongmen makes it easier for strongmen to get a hold of a country, of a government. A lot to think about there. I'll link to the article in the description as it was very interesting. So without further ado, let's talk about Volume 2 of Swamp Thing. I will do a summary, a little bit of an analysis, and we will move on from there. So Volume 2 of Swamp Thing takes place after the events, a little bit after the events of the first volume, where Swamp Thing had defeated the Monkey King, came into conflict with Etrigan, the rhyming demon, and also defeated Dr. Jason Woodrue. But at the end, Matt, Swamp Thing's friend, and Abby, Arcane's husband, was in a car accident, and he seemingly got taken control of by a demon. So what happened there? Well, at the start of this, Swamp Thing is agitated. He's still thinking about the fact that he is not actually Alec Holland, but rather a collective conscious of the swamp that has the memories of Alec Holland. And he sends Abby away at some point, but he finds the bones of Alec Holland in the swamp, and he buries them, and that's supposed to be the symbolic death of Alec Holland, presumably. Abby, meanwhile, has a nightmare about Matt, and she comes to realize that Matt is not actually Matt, but he is a bug-infested copy that has been possessed by Arcane, her uncle who is back from the dead. And also apparently she had sex with the Arcane version of Matt, which is kind of gross and creepy because he's infested by bugs, but he's also her uncle. And Arcane is mad and wants to destroy Swamp Thing for having killed him very recently. Arcane sends out waves to violence, which cause the most hardened killers in Louisiana to assault other people and hurt people. And we also see a still of Joker in Arkham Asylum, and he's just dazed and not even able to talk with any of the prison guards. Arcane reveals that Abby is dead when Arcane has a fight with a Swamp Thing, although he suggests that she might not actually be dead as well. But Swamp Thing reveals that he is no longer the old Swamp Thing, and he is something that Arcane has never actually fought before, someone who recognizes who they truly are. And he manages to defeat Arcane, and in the process, Matt dies. Swamp Thing tries to bring Abby back, but he is not able to, and he ends up deciding to travel with Abby along with Etrigan into the afterlife. And in the afterlife, Swamp Thing encounters Deadman, presumably a DC or Vertigo hero. He encounters the Phantom Stranger, who is a mysterious person in his life who helps him out pretty frequently, but also does a number of other strange things. And he also encounters Alec Holland in the afterlife, who is celebrating paradise with his wife, who died when he did. And so you get a little bit of a send off to Alec there as well. Swamp Thing and Etrigan actually go to hell in this version of the afterlife, and they seek to rescue Abby. They run into another version of Arcane, who is sort of suffering in hell, and he tries to keep him there, but they manage to escape without too many issues. The story then diverts to another sort of focus where an alien from a different species comes to visit Earth and runs into Swamp Thing, and they have a fun encounter. There's another story where Abby is in the Dreaming and encounters Cain and Abel, and I think Matthew the Raven is also there, which is funny because Matthew the Raven is her version of Matt, although I don't think she realizes that. She also learns about Alex Olsen there, Alex being the previous incarnation of Swamp Thing, and it's indicated that this is actually a cycle that happens pretty frequently. I don't know if they're going to elaborate on that in further volumes, but it does sound interesting that there has been more than one Swamp Thing. And then in the final installment, the final issue in this series, or in this volume, Abby and Swamp Thing have sex, which is weird and also sort of cosmic and all connecting around nature. It's meant to be beautiful, but it's also just kind of weird, but it's very in line with how Alan Moore writes things for this to even exist. And that's really where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, Alan Moore continues to provide us with a little bit to think about. The running theme throughout this series appears to be identity, or consciousness, or those sorts of ideas, where Alan Moore is writing about some more in depth into what Swamp Thing is and who Alec Holland was. Because you see in the story that Swamp Thing buries Alec, which is existential in a lot of ways, because he's not only providing like rest for this person who died in a violent way, but he's also putting to mind his rest that he is no longer Alec Holland. He is accepting this new knowledge that he has gained and trying to move forward with that knowledge and trying to really identify who Swamp Thing is now and realizing that he's a protector of the earth. So there's a clear distinction, even more so, where it was a bit wavy, like maybe Swamp Thing could have accepted that he was that, but also wanted to be Alec Holland. Here it's more clear that Swamp Thing is choosing not to be Alec Holland, and he's choosing the Swamp Thing identity as his own. And along with this is Swamp Thing acknowledging that he is stronger, that he is no longer the Swamp Thing of the past, where he felt he was burdened by maybe the strength of Alec. Instead, when Swamp Thing encounters Arcane, Swamp Thing pretty much says, we've never fought before. I am something like you have never seen. And it's really interesting that he says that, because it's he's saying that Arcane's fought Swamp Thing, assuming the identity of Alec Holland, but here's a brand new Swamp Thing. Again, he's getting kind of philosophical. It's kind of acknowledging that Swamp Thing is more in line with Earth and Alan Moore's interpretation that he's a representation of nature and whatnot. But it's still interesting that that Arcane calls him Alec Holland. Like, Arcane is maybe the last vestige of his past that Swamp Thing has to get rid of in order to be something new. Now, is that what's going to happen going forward? Is this going to be the true representation of Swamp Thing? Well, at least in Alan Moore's interpretation, that seems to be the case. But given that there's more volumes in the series, we have to read along to find out. Another interesting element of this story, going along with identity and Swamp Thing being one with the earth, is that a reborn Swamp Thing realizes that everything is one, everything is connected. This further establishes him as a hero of nature, that he is fighting for the Louisiana swamplands, that he's fighting for the earth against people who would seem to defile nature or harm it in some way, or people who just seem to go against what is considered natural. Because, of course, there's Arcane, and Arcane is supernatural, just a supernatural term, but also he's from hell. He's clawed back. He's not of this plane anymore, of this plane of existence. He is something otherworldly, and he wishes to cause harm to Swamp Thing and the world around him. And so Swamp Thing now has to defend this world against Arcane. And I like that Alan Moore makes that distinction, that Arcane is unnatural in this case. It wasn't so much so the case with Jason Woodrue, but maybe he was trying to, his plan wasn't really fit with what plants were capable of doing. So I guess there's another connection that, like, he was trying to go beyond what was natural in that case. Related to this is also, like, Abby and Swamp Thing is one when they have sex, or when Swamp Thing gives her a piece of fruit and that changes her mind so that they are able to intertwine as one. Abby realizes that Swamp Thing and her are only one, and that to see anything else as apart is to deny the reality of the world. And so it seems like Alan Moore is getting very interconnected, getting very sort of hippie, I want to say Confucian, or even Buddhist in that way, where everything is one, and to see things as separate is to deny what's really there. I don't know where he's going to go with this, if he's going to say anything, if it was just something that was interesting, but it'd be interesting if he elaborated on and had a villain come in that sort of challenged it, or forced Swamp Thing to work in that way. And there are a number of other interesting elements to Volume 2 of Swamp Thing. Arcane is a very good villain, especially when he comes back and he's just taunting Swamp Thing and just being a general ass about everything, and actually going forward and hurting Abby and everyone, proving that he's a pretty strong threat up until Swamp Thing realizes that he is way more powerful than Arcane to begin with. In addition to this, it's very interesting to see the influences that this would have on other works, particularly the Sandman series. One, because the story of Swamp Thing entering hell is something that Neil Gaiman borrows upon in a couple of issues of the Sandman series. Like, it really seems lifted, or even straight up plagiarized at times. Or maybe it's just Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman were doing the same thing with Swamp Thing and Sandman. But I think it really establishes that, like, without Volume 2, without the Alan Moore's contribution to Swamp Thing, you might not see the Sandman, or it might look very different. And it's very beautiful in that way, that, like, both of these authors, for a long time I've been thinking, like, oh, these two are quite similar, and this really highlights how similar these two are. And that's not a bad thing. Like, they're both writing about high-minded ideas with, like, a lot of substance, a lot of juice, a lot to think about there, and it's always fun to read both of these authors. However, there are a couple of problems with this volume in particular, and one of them is that it falls into the trap of comic book deaths, particularly with Arcane and Abby, where, like, both of them, like, Arcane dies in a previous installment and just comes back in this one, and it feels like people didn't have enough time to really think about the death. It's just, Alan Moore's going to bring him back. And then the same thing kind of happens with Abby in the same edition, where Abby dies, but Swamp Thing just goes into hell and grabs her and comes out. It seems like there's very little struggle and very little time to think about the death of someone so close to Swamp Thing. And so what is even the point of killing off characters, or death in general? What are the stakes involved here if characters can just come back almost immediately, if it's no thing for Swamp Thing to bring people back from the dead? It seems like Alan Moore hasn't quite thought that through. Another thing is that the Swamp Thing sex, where Abby and Swamp Thing are interconnected, it's pretty weird. I wouldn't say it's out of the way, like bad or anything like that, but it does kind of conflict with a lot of the ideas and the overall tone of the Swamp Thing series, where you have violent death and creepy monsters and people going to hell, and then right next to it you have zany aliens and also Abby and Swamp Thing having sex. It doesn't seem to be consistency there. But that said, it's still very interesting and very beautiful in terms of the art and the comic book drawings there. So not bad. It's just it feels like it doesn't belong at times. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Swamp Thing, Volume 2 of the series so far, by Alan Moore, with art by a lot of people who I didn't mention at the beginning of this video. Overall, I would say I enjoyed it, and it's been a consistent enjoyment. There's been down parts here and there throughout the series, but not enough to completely take away my enjoyment from the series. I do hope Volume 3 and 4 goes in a new direction. It definitely feels like Alan Moore is starting to repeat himself at the end of this one, and I'd like to see him talk about some new ideas, introduce some new characters, and just explore what Swamp Thing can be. If you read this before, you simply want to comment on something I said here, do so below. Let's have a continued discussion about Swamp Thing. Also, don't forget to check out Lucas's video over at the Bits of Lit so that you can see what he thought. We often differ on these things, so it's good to hear from both of us. And then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this series if they don't already know about it. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and interconnected travels. Farewell.